Welcome to the very best part of my broadcast week. I recently traveled to Eau Claire, Wisconsin to witness a day-long tent revival filled with politics and voter mobilization. While there, I met a man named Lance Wallnau, an influential leader in the charismatic Christian movement, and he's an unapologetic supporter of former President Trump. In this episode, you'll hear him differ from earlier evangelical leaders aligned with Republicans, and you'll hear about Cyrus, an influential figure in the Old Testament's book of Isaiah.
So what I watched today, was that about spiritual revival or political activism?
That's a good question. That's a combination platter. It's about spiritual activism.
Explain how that works or doesn't work in the political sphere in the context of this upcoming election.
Well, okay. Christians have as much at stake as anybody else in terms of what goes on within America. They probably make up a large part of the Republican voting party, like 30 million probably voters, so it's a significant chunk. Their concerns are pretty much the same as other Americans' concerns. They're concerned about schools, about crime, about drugs, about the border, about the future, about the economy. The difference is, I think, that they became more politically awakened during 2016. You'll start to see the conservative Christian movement beginning to express a kind of apocalyptic anxiety about the future. That anxiety didn't get any easier from COVID till today. So there's a real worry that there's a spiritual decline happening in America. And from their perspective, the geopolitical world is also a spiritual world, and culture is as much a byproduct of the health of its society, and the Christians play a role in being able to maintain a healthy kind of a civil discourse. And when you're watching the country veer in the direction it's been going in the last couple of years, it just creates an even greater sense of we better get involved. We better at least let our own influence be felt, or perhaps we're going to end up becoming a persecuted people, something which we weren't before. Rather than just being part of American culture, we'll be vilified. And a lot of that's been happening, I'm afraid, in media, probably because of politics, probably the moment that which is the concern a lot of Christian preachers have had, that, gee, if you ever get involved politically, well, then you end up making enemies that you didn't have before, and then you end up becoming a persecuted political class. And there's a little bit of that concern, too.
So when I first started covering national politics, there was the remnants of the moral majority, which were very much part of the 80s. Then I got to know Ralph Reed, I got to know Mr. Dobson. How does what you're talking about differ or augment those movements in the history of American Christianity and political involvement?
That's great. So you have had history. So when Jerry Falwell came on the scene with the moral majority, my wave wasn't even involved. I mean, I'm like, my late 60s. So there's a whole lot of people that are involved now in Trump's world that weren't even on board when Ralph Reed was working for Pat Robertson's first election, right? And I think that that's the difference. A lot of that became establishment Republican, oddly enough. So Ralph Reed becomes a political consultant. You can't find Jerry Falwell's moral majority, the movement, kind of like dissipated. I think the Tea Party kind of picked up some of the grassroots activism of Christians that were embedded over there. But I think it was when Trump came along that an odd coalition started emerging, which was a whole bunch of new populist Christian engagement that were waking up to the fact that the political world is a little bit more menacing than we thought, and we better get engaged with it, or it could become an adversarial world very quickly. So Trump became kind of a fascinating figure because as a populist person, he didn't talk like a politician. Right. And so for that reason, a lot of grassroots folks that maybe were never engaged with politics said, well, actually, I can understand what he's talking about because it's, if you get past his style, he's actually saying something which nobody else is saying. He's a non-politician. And that picked up a whole other group of populism, within the Christian community.
I've heard some people say, from their vantage point, Trump is a chosen one. Others say he's anointed. Is there a difference, and is there a meaningful difference from your vantage point?
Yeah, well, it's not unusual. If you there's always a wrestling to try to find meaning, right? Mm-hmm. So the term fourth turning's tossed around a lot. And that's, that's the classic paradigm that every 80 to so years, the United States goes through a shift. And in that shift, we go through a national crisis, whether it's the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, the late Depression, World War II, or where we are now. So that every fourth turning is a crisis of definition. At those times, it isn't that far-fetched to believe that a Christian community, some 20 or 30 million strong, that are biblical, that are admonished all the way back from 2,000 years ago, pray for rulers and those that are in authority, that you may lead a godly and peaceful life. The premise of Christianity is that prayer is real, God is real, and that God hears prayers. So when you're praying in a fourth turning or in a turning, what pops up are unusual kinds of deliverers. You find like a Washington is iconic, a Lincoln is iconic, a Churchill, a Roosevelt's iconic. And people like me would say Trump becomes a once-in-a-thousand-year meteor that shoots over. You're not going to find a whole lot of future politicians like Trump that come out of private enterprise, have a media background, and somehow capture the popular zeitgeist and are able to actually come in from the outside as a novice and become a president. That's kind of when you're getting biblical. Like, there you're praying and emerges a person. I caught that idea in 2015 when I first met Trump. I met him up at Trump Towers. And at that time, I ran across Isaiah 45, and I said, oh my gosh, this guy is like the character Cyrus in the Bible, in that he's a deliverer who God raises up prophetically. Isaiah is prophesying a future deliverer named Cyrus. And he's not even Jewish. And I said, this is going to really, and I wrote this in a book. I said, Trump derangement will happen, because I used the term before it was popularized, and I said, because this guy has a Cyrus quality that I believe means that he's an outsider. Even evangelicals are going to have a problem with him, because he's not going to come in as Ted Cruz or as Mike Huckabee or as Ben Carson or even a good Catholic like Marco Rubio. He's going to come in as a guy from Queens on his third marriage. And oddly enough, Isaiah 45 describes somebody who is an outsider who emerges as a deliverer for God's people. And so to me, it was coincidental, but nevertheless prophetically significant. I said, hey man, the 45th president will be an Isaiah 45 Cyrus. And he'll be likened to Cyrus even historically. And I said that, and I got a lot of pushback after he got elected, because they were searching around for how could the evangelicals justify voting for some, barbaric character like Trump, and they're hypocrites that they are. They say they're righteous, but they voted for Trump. And my name came up, and I think it justifiably came up, because I created a Cyrus narrative for evangelicals, which says that God sometimes raises up an outsider to deliver his people. And even in Cyrus, the Cyrus typology in Isaiah the prophet says, I am a God who hides himself, and says that I'm choosing him though he knows me not. And so I even encompassed that, and I said, listen, give the guy some time. He doesn't know who we are, but his values resonate with our community. God's raising up an outsider, the Cyrus type. And Netanyahu actually likened him to Cyrus, which was my deliverance, because I was getting a lot of pushback on, I guess it was Messiah University. A professor said, oh, these Christians create what's called vessel theology. They pick a vessel in the Bible, and then they make a personality like him. And I thought, oh gosh, it's kind of vessel theology. Maybe that's not exactly what I was doing. But when Netanyahu likened Trump to Cyrus, didn't he? And it was when the embassy was moved, and he came to the White House and said, the Jewish people have a long memory, and we will remember Cyrus. We remember Cyrus of old, and we will remember you. And when that happened, I said, man, I got it more accurate than I thought. But that's what I predicted in 2016. And and it's pulled true. So yeah, we're in a fourth turning. I'd say Trump is a Cyrus type, and I would say that to the extent that Christians have been praying for a deliverer, he is. Now, whether or not he'll be able to deliver us in this cycle, I don't know.
This Trump as Cyrus typology has gained significant traction among charismatic Christians. When we come back, Wallnau's take on forces arrayed against Trump.
He's virtually up against academia, media, government, the intelligence communities, and to an extent, a whole lot of corporate businesses.
Welcome back. Wallnau sees insidious forces lined up against Trump. He also believes the U.S. intelligence community is complicit. Facts that suggest otherwise and the due process rights afforded to Trump do not dilute Wallnau's belief that Trump is up against actual demons.
From your vantage point, Lance, what is he up against?
Well, Trump is up against, it's a fascinating thought if you think about it. He's like Samson. He's got his hands between two pillars, and he's up against the entire intelligence community. Imagine you're him, and in your mind, you have been spied on in your campaign, and nobody ever took it seriously, and you said that they've done it. And you look at them as having concocted a Russian narrative with Perkins Coie coming up with the Russian dossier, and nothing's ever been done about it. You've seen them try to impeach you twice, and you do believe, like Chuck Schumer warned them about, hey, the intelligence agencies have 100 ways from Sunday to get you. Now you found out what he meant. And then you have your Mar-a-Lago home, broken into by the FBI. We could argue that evidence manipulated and planted for a picture. The Russian laptop is, is being redefined as Russian in origin by 50 intelligence community people. So I think the great danger he's got is that if he is going back to office in order to rectify past crimes done against him, for the sake of making sure that never happens again in American politics, there's a whole layer of intelligence community people that have to be nervous about his emergence. And I've heard some of them characterize it as we're going to leave the country and stuff, like he's on a personal vendetta. It's not. I think he's on an institutional reform vendetta. And having been burned that way and almost put in jail and threatened with, I looked at his face in some of those pictures. He wasn't treating this with a fist bump in the air, fight, fight, fight. When he was in the courtrooms, he's shook and he's sitting there listening. He's realizing these cats can actually lock me up. What kind of strength do they have? And so you've lost $300 million in one clip, $80 million in another clip in two trials. You're still waiting sentencing on another thing, which was tried in New York City, which in your opinion is a rigged jury system, on trumped up charges on the Stormy Daniels situation. So I think all of that has had a psychological effect on him. And it's, in my opinion, it's created in him a sense of this is serious, it's personal, but it's also America. We cannot let this kind of targeting of a political opponent take place at an institutional level. So he's up against them. And that's just the intelligence community part. He's up against the entire Democrat machinery because they have, governments, these elections are $2 trillion affairs. There's a million positions involved. There's lots of money. The labor unions, foreign policies involved. He's up against the entire media apparatus, if you don't mind me saying so. Because, I'm always amazed at the fundraising because I'm thinking, well, Kamala's got 200 million raised and Trump's got X million raised. My gosh, the media gave Trump like what? $1 billion worth of free advertising by mistake in 2016, a mistake they're not doing a second time. But that was all free advertising that he got. And all of that machinery is going on. What's the buzz today? It's going to be, it's Camelot, only with a K for Kamala. I just noticed, like New York Magazine, New Yorker. So it's going to be Camelot with Kamala. And she's going to have a 100-day blitzkrieg honeymoon in media. So he's up against the entire media establishment. Forget academia. Academia, from my perspective, has been taken over so much by the left in its departments that he's virtually up against academia, media, government, the intelligence communities, and to an extent a whole lot of corporate businesses. To say nothing of the tech companies who have a history of
Although it seems like they're reassessing right now.
Yeah?
It seems like they're reassessing right now, some in the tech world.
Yeah, well, they are, and for good reason, because they recognize that they're a little bit beyond politics is economics. And my God, you know what? Where's the future more stable for you economically? Anyway, that's a long way to say he's up against pretty much a lot.
Would I be wrong if I interpreted some of the rhetoric I heard today as that he's up against something other than that, something that borders on demonic or spirits that are evil?
You didn't hear that wrong. You heard that right. Yeah, so to the extent that government can be empowered by other forces. So in a biblical worldview, you have principalities, powers, rulers of the darkness of this world that work through ideation or through ideologies that embody themselves in people and in gates of influence. And so you look back in history and you say, well, it's demonic what Stalin did. You know, like you listen to Bill Federer, if you heard his presentation today. And you go through that and you go, now, I listen to him because I always get something out of it. And you say, you know, I had no idea that that there was that much organized evil behind, you know, CIA operations, for instance, in a coup with other countries. Or if you're dealing with, like I said, if you're dealing with Mao and their purges in China, or what Stalin did. I understand what the brown shirts were all about in Hitler's day. So if you're a Christian and you really believe in spiritual activity and your spiritual realm is real, then how does that spirit realm work? It wants to embody its will through some kind of a vehicle, and that vehicle is going to have disproportionate power if it's at these gates of influence. So therefore you pray for rulers and those who are in authority. That's what Paul said. Two groups, rulers and authority. Why? So that we can lead a godly and peaceable life. That means that more than anything, rulers and people that are in gates of influence have disproportionate power to make your life miserable or good, depending on if they're virtuous or if they're corrupt. So pray for rulers. And if you've got spiritual forces that are going to congregate anywhere, they're going to congregate around those gates of influence. And so suddenly you can find your courts can be taken over by an influence that's spiritual, and the ideologies that predominate there could actually end up becoming hostile to freedom of speech or your own rights.
Can, from your perspective, Lance, an energized Christian sit out this election?
Can an energized Christian? I don't see how anyone with moral clarity sits out an election like this. I mean, the issues are so clear. If it was about tax reform, you know, something, tariffs, I could see.
Medicare reimbursement rates or something?
Yeah, I mean, real estate, I'm out. I'm checking out. I mean, I was checked out all during the Clinton years, frankly. And but when you're talking about whether or not the state has the authority to keep a parent from being informed about their child's struggle with their gender identity, who actually has authority over the child, the state or the parent? When it gets to something like that, man, and I've got friends of mine that have 13-year-old girls, 12-year-old girls that were actually in the transitioning process because something was going on in their school that the parent didn't know about, that was actually educating them and encouraging them to make that decision as to what they were. Now, that's just that one alone. That's why we had like Jenny Donnelly speak. So I said, let the mama bear speak, because the moms have a unique perspective on the threat that's coming up with their children that I don't have, but I listen to them. You can't be neutral on, let's take, and I tell Christians, I say, you know what would you say during the Civil War? Would you say, you got the border states, you got Kentucky and Maryland, and Delaware.
Right.
The border states had an interesting message in the pulpit. I read a thesis of a guy that submitted. He said, what was being preached during the Civil War in the South? They didn't preach slavery. They preached states' rights. Exactly. They made their cause noble. Federal government taking our rights away and destroying our way of life. In the North, they preached, once they got past the Emancipation Proclamation period, it was about freeing the slaves in the South. They ennobled their cause. Right. The border states didn't preach either message. They said their message was, preach the kingdom and stay out of politics. Preach the kingdom. This was the primary pulpit message. In other words, avoid the incendiary conflict of culture over political differences, North and South, and let's focus on the Word of God in the Bible. I would say that most pulpits in America today are border state pulpits, where because the congregation can be either Democrat or Republican, because the issues get complicated, you may have had some members in your church that have had an abortion, you don't want to be offending them about coming out too strong. You may have some folks there whose kids are in the gay lifestyle, and you don't want to alienate them. So you start doing calculus. You're a border state preacher in a lot of churches. It requires acumen we've never had needed before to be able to deal with some of the issues we're dealing with. So that's a long way of saying, I don't see how you could be sitting on the sidelines now in an election like this any more than you could sit on the sidelines during Lincoln's second election. in 1864. Right. I think you have a moral obligation to be clear about the issues and to use what little influence you've got to make a difference.
Moral clarity and election denialism has collided with Wallnau and his supporters. We will explore that next.
The tendency to just look at elections, pray about them, eat popcorn, watch the result, and then go to bed is over.
Welcome back to the Takeout. Wallnau's 2020 election denialism electrified charismatic Christians, some of whom attended the Capitol riot, and flags associated with this movement were flown proudly on that fateful day. What this all means is, of course, part of the 2024 conversation as well.
Well, if you believe those issues the way I'm describing them, then the starkness of those, the starkness between the two is pretty significant. Do you got a copy of our book here at all? No, you don't.
I'll get, I promise.
No. The reason why I'm saying that is because I just went through it. I wrote this book for 2020, and it was Biden-Harris and Trump. And it's a comparison of all of the issues on a voter's guide. And I realized there's like 15 values issues. It's like Ralph Reed comes out with them, right?
Yeah.
But, and I only can think of the top 4, which I just gave you. But it's amazing. I mean, there's enough information there so that if you are a believer, you should be able to go either or, and the contrast is pretty significant.
What role do you think you played and your advocacy played after the 2020 election in the days leading up to January 6th?
In the advocacy role leading up to January?
Yeah.
I think...
or the rhetorical role you played, however you see it.
Well, I've been thinking a little bit about that lately because I'm wondering, even after the election, even beyond that, regardless of whether Trump wins or Trump
Meaning this
loses.
next one?
Yeah.
Okay.
And because Mario's said to me, who's my buddy who does the evening meetings, he says, I think the courage tour will continue. And I was just thinking of it as a mechanism up to the election. He said, no, I think it'll continue. I think there's going to be a need for this even afterward. And what I suspect is that it's still going to be an environment where Christians are going to need courage in order to own that they believe, be clear about what they believe, and then figure out what is the proper way of being a witness to what you believe. Is it certainly by civil discourse? Could it be by civil disobedience? If a pastor is told he can't say something, it's hate speech. Well, then I'll be at that fight, and I'll be one of those people that'll feel the pressure to say what can't be said, because I believe it's important to preserve that freedom. In what other ways are we going to have, as a culture, to take a stand? My sense is that my role will still be to rally believers in business, in education, parents, and in local elections, to make sure they're clear about their values and that they're organizing their influence in a far more effective way than we have in the past. The tendency to just look at elections, pray about them, eat popcorn, watch the result, and then go to bed is over. I think the left is vigilant. I mean, when I look at the Democratic Party, one thing I'm fascinated by is how they treat this as a calling, So if you're an environmentalist, you're that way 24 hours a day for the rest of your life. You're not just that way for an election cycle. So I think, Christians as believers probably should be engaged in this process of shaping culture far more aggressively and intentionally from now on, because it's being shaped without them.
Does that aggression create any space for violence?
The violence that everybody's afraid about for Christians is probably one of the great irritants that folks like us have. I mean, here we're a movement which is basically following somebody who let themselves get martyred. So our movement isn't a movement of physical aggression. It's a movement of persuasion. The weapons of our warfare are communicating. And so that's what, the Apostle Paul described. The weapons of our warfare are divinely powerful to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down imaginations, and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. It's a proposition of a different worldview and a different idea. So the Christian's weapons aren't violence. Christians' weapons are actually communication and maybe modeling that kind of patient restraint in the face of violence that would cause people to draw a contrast between the follower of Jesus and the person who persecutes them.
Last question. If I get back to D.C. and someone says, hey, Major, where were you yesterday? I say, well, I was at a tent revival in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. And they'd be like, what's that?
Yeah.
Answer me that question.
You should have been at the meeting last night. That was the tent revival. In the evening, we preach the gospel and we pray for the sick and we worship God and we do what's characteristic of great Christian evangelism. And nobody does it better, in my opinion, than Mario Murillo. During the daytime, this is a totally different thing. This is what we would call Reformation. It's not a typical tent revival thing. It's meeting with Christians in a tent in a revival environment where in the daytime you're challenging them, you're educating them, you're equipping them to be able to live their faith out more effectively in their communities so that when you take the eternal issues that are discussed in the evening of heaven and hell and where will you spend eternity, when you wake up in the morning, where are you going to live on planet Earth? So we're the planet Earth part. How does a Christian live out their faith on Earth? That's the morning part. And I think it's more of it's a Reformation academy than it is a tent meeting.
With a political thrust.
Yeah, because politics is where it's at right now. If it was, but then again, you could hear, we could be talking about the Olympics. We could be talking about arts. We could be talking about movies right now. We could be talking about certainly academia. So it doesn't matter. It's not like it's only politics. We're 100 days away from a national election. It's going to be politically flavored. But like I said today, Christians are called to go into all the world and make disciples of nations. It's going to be hard not to get involved with government, family, arts, media, business, because Christianity has an axiom and a worldview and a proposition that touches every realm. And we believe it brings life.
And you don't want to exclude non-Christians, you just want Christians at the table.
Oh, actually, we certainly don't want to exclude non-Christians.
You want to keep the pluralism of America.
Yeah, well, sure. The pluralism is the pluralism. I mean, even Christianity makes its progress because of the diverse elements that engage it. So I'm charismatic. I was rejected by the evangelicals and fundamentalists. Why? Because they perceive me to be an outsider. Actually, Christianity thrives on God doing something new all the time. And so we're always very humble and very careful about embracing the new thing. I mean, back to politics. When Trump came along, I can't tell you the number of people thought I was off my rocker because I said, I think that's going to be the direction. And they said, why would God choose Trump? That was their thinking. And I said, well, just have to watch and find out.
Lance, I appreciate the time very much.
Thank you.
A gentleman named Matthew Taylor also traveled to Eau Claire. Matthew is a scholar who specializes in Christian nationalism in America. He has a new book called The Violent Take It by Force. Many Christians we met at this tent revival called themselves Christian patriots or nationalists. We began our conversation with Taylor there.
Matthew, what have we witnessed here?
Well, we've witnessed what we scholars would call a form of Christian nationalism. They might object. In fact, they have objected it several times to that terminology, but on an objective kind of scholarly level, religious nationalism is where people blend their religious identities with their partisan and national identities to kind of form a narrative about their country, about their nation, that is also a religious narrative and a spiritual narrative. And they're merging their own spirituality with their sense of patriotism, their sense of obligation to their country.
They call themselves Christian patriots.
Yes.
Is there a distinction between a Christian patriot and a Christian nationalist?
Some people would say that patriotism is about love of country, where nationalism is about hate of people who are not a part of your country. I think that's a fair definition. That's not an objective definition, though, right? As with any terminology, there's a spectrum of meanings for all these terms. And I would say that Christian nationalism itself is a spectrum. There are soft forms of Christian nationalism that are mostly benign. I mean, people singing God Bless America, you could say that's a form of Christian nationalism. I don't think that's any real threat to American democracy. Mm-hmm. People putting American flags in their churches could be seen as a form of Christian nationalism. Some people might say, well, that's more Christian patriotism. There's no firm line between those two things. I would call this a fairly extreme form of Christian nationalism, though. This is a hardened form of Christian nationalism. What I would even call, at least in the case of Lance Wallnau, a form of Christian supremacy. That these folks believe that Christians, by dint of being Christians, should have more rights and privileges in society, and that Christianity should be privileged over other worldviews, over other perspectives, whether they be religious or non-religious in society. That Christianity and Christians should have a coercive power over the rest of society. And I think that that is actually a real danger to democracy.
We traveled to Eau Claire, Wisconsin to better understand the political importance of people like Wallnau and those who follow him to the tent revivals or online. Taylor explains that when we return.
In a pluralistic democracy, we have to be able to hear our opponents. We have to be able to have conversation. We have to be able to compromise. But there's no compromise with demons.
Welcome back to The Takeout. We talked to Matthew Taylor about this movement and the January 6th riot, how charismatic Christians view opposition to the 2020 election results as more than politics, as something approaching a divine calling, and how they view mobilization in this upcoming election in much the same way.
What is the political import, possibly, in the 2024 election of events like this?
You know, I've got a book coming out about January 6th, and January 6th didn't happen overnight. There was a long process, there was a long buildup during the 2020 election of discourse like this, of conversations like this, that said our country is on the verge of collapse unless Donald Trump wins. And in fact, there were many people from these communities, including people like Lance Wallnau, who said, our prophets tell us that Donald Trump is destined to win this election, that he must win this election, that it's God's will for him to win this election. And once Donald Trump denied the results of the election, people like Lance Wallnau and many of the speakers here today were a part of the mobilization effort to enlist Christians to buy into Donald Trump's election lies and to use Christian spirituality and Christian theology to undergird and support and propagandize those election lies. And then many of the people who were leaders in this movement also showed up on January 6th and were key in mobilizing Christians and galvanizing Christians to be there, and then showed up there themselves because they really believed that the election was being stolen. Not because they had any facts to back that up, but because they had prophecies, because they had experiences that told them, they had a gut feeling that Donald Trump was right. And that led them to participate in an attempt in many ways to overthrow our democracy. That to me is what's so concerning, is we are now heading into another election where Donald Trump is one of the major candidates. And what happens if Donald Trump loses and denies the results again? Much of the rhetoric here today, much of the rhetoric you hear from people who are part of this movement, they're saying they got away with stealing one election from us and from Trump. We're not going to let that happen again. And we saw where that rhetoric led in late 2020 and early 2021. It could very easily lead to the same violent outcomes, the same chaos, the same mis- and disinformation campaigns that we saw at the end of 2020. And I also worry that with the narratives that these folks are participating in, that Donald Trump is divinely anointed, that God is using Donald Trump, that Donald Trump has a special purpose in the hands of God. Well, if Trump wins, then that becomes a part of the impetus that Donald Trump can say, I don't just have a democratic mandate, I have a divine mandate to change the country in accordance with the biblical values that these folks claim to have. And that would be a very radically different America from the pluralistic democracy that we have right now.
Several people here have talked to me about the 19 counties.
Yes.
What is that about?
So the America First Policy Institute, which is a think tank that was started after the 2020 election that includes many people who are part of the Trump administration. The America First Policy Institute identified 19 counties in 9 swing states. These are all suburban counties. They all have more than 400,000 people in them. They're all purple counties. And the intent is to flip those 19 counties, to have them all go red, have them all become Republican counties. And they believe, AFPI believes, that if they can swing those 19 counties, they can swing those 9 swing states, they can win the presidential election and win the Senate. And what Wallnau and the Courage Tour has explicitly said is they are targeting those 19 counties. They are doing this in coordination with AFPI. In fact, I would say what we are seeing here today is the most targeted and tactical voter mobilization effort done by Christian nationalists ever. And they're doing it hand in glove in many ways with the Trump campaign and with the apparatus of the Trump campaign through organizations like AFPI.
A tent is behind you. Is that an accident or a coincidence?
So in many ways, what this event is evoking is the tent revival, which has been a part of American culture really since the 19th century and the Second Great Awakening. There's been a history of Christians gathering outside of church buildings for particular and special events, for a spiritual renewal, to hear select speakers. And so this event is piggybacking off of the stylings of a tent revival. And it began this morning with a time of Christian worship, with Lance Wallnau inviting people to come forward and speak in tongues if they'd never done that before. So this is a part of that charismatic tradition that is trying to access the supernatural dimensions of early Christianity, things like speaking in tongues, things like prophecy, things like healing. So they're using that, but then there was an almost immediate pivot after that into speaking directly about American politics, speaking directly about encouraging people to vote for Donald Trump, encouraging people to get involved in the election, encouraging people to become election workers, right? So this is, it has the stylings of a revival, and they talk a lot about revival, but then they're also talking about what they call reformation. And they would say revival, and Wallnau said this, revival is personal, reformation is institutional. And so they're using the experiences of charismatic spirituality to galvanize Christians politically and saying, now you've had these experiences, you've had an experience of healing, you've had an experience of speaking in tongues, now we need to go and use that to change our country, use that to take back our country for God. And that's a very powerful emotional matrix, a very powerful emotional experience that they're offering to people. But then when they pivot and use that politically, that's where I start to get worried.
It was suggested that a Christian would count a vote differently than a non-Christian, or somebody who was a Christian here in particular would count votes differently.
That is the suggestion. I mean, the premise of this event, and you can hear it in almost every one of the speakers who've gone today, is that the 2020 election was stolen. And they believe, and they are gearing up because they believe that the 2024 election there will be an attempt to steal it. And for these folks, it's not purely about legal machinations. It's not, they believe that it was a demonic conspiracy that stole the 2020 election. And this was a major factor in what happened on January 6th, where Christian believers who believed that a conspiracy of demons manifesting through the Democratic Party, manifesting through disloyal Republicans, manifesting through Mike Pence, was preventing Trump from winning the election and from fulfilling the will of God. This rhetoric that is going on here parallels that very, very directly.
So it's not just disagreement, it's demonism.
Yes, they are literally demonizing their enemies and saying our enemies are inspired by demons. In fact, Wallnau just this past week said that Kamala Harris, you can't even hear her speaking because it's just demons speaking through her. And so the problem is, in a pluralistic democracy, we have to be able to hear our opponents. We have to be able to have conversation. We have to be able to compromise. But there's no compromise with demons. In these folks' worldview, if it's demons that are behind the stealing of election, they must be exorcised and opposed and defeated. And so when they are mobilizing Christians who are already in this election denial mode, who've already bought into narratives of election denial, when they're asking and inviting and encouraging and training those people to go and become election workers, they're in many ways presetting the narrative to deny the election. Part of the reason the attempt to overturn the 2020 election was unsuccessful is that they couldn't produce any evidence, because there was no evidence. And every legal challenge that they made, it made them look pretty foolish because there was no evidence. This is in many ways I don't think it's cynical, but I think it's dangerous, an effort to pre-position people who are already bought into that narrative in the role of counting the electoral votes or counting the voters who are voting in these different states. And when they've already bought into the narrative that this is being stolen, well, then they're primed to believe lies about the election. And they could create an enormous amount of chaos in the aftermath of this election if Trump loses. If Trump wins, then they'll just celebrate because they already believe that that's what has to happen.
In 2016, Trump won Wisconsin by just over 23,000 votes. Biden won Wisconsin in 2020 by just over 20,000 votes. Concentrated political energy in places like Wisconsin, therefore, matter. We hope you enjoyed this look at one of those pockets of energy. We'll see you next week.